What is up, YouTube? I'm Devon, DaVinci, leader of the Renaissance crew, and you're watching DaVinci Reacts. Today I'm going to be getting into a video that is actually very interesting because this video was created by two content creators that I am big fans of. One is the Cynical Historian, somebody I've seen a lot of their videos. I'm a big fan of theirs. I love historians because usually they tend to be very unbiased and look at things right down the middle and just based on context. They understand context very well, or at least you can tell when a historian is being biased. And a cynical historian is somebody that is someone I trust when it comes to relating history. And this video also features Atun-Shei films. If you are unfamiliar with Atun-Shei films, I have done a lot of their videos. I have reacted to their Checkmate Lincolnites and their Aryan archaeology. I've reacted to. I still got to check out the Witch Hunter. That's gonna be the next one I check out. But with that being said, let's jump into this and see what it has to offer. This video is called American Influence on the French Revolution. Now, I know the key things, like I know that Thomas Jefferson played a part in writing the I don't know if it was the Constitution or Articles of that first French Republic, but I know that he played a very big hand in writing down like the initial articles or whatever else. Like, I don't know the official term for it, but I know he had a big part in that. And yeah, it's very interesting. Like recently I did a video about what would the world be like if America didn't exist, and in it we talk about like the impact that certain events would happen. It mainly focused on World War II and stuff like that, but I felt like it didn't go far enough back. And one of the things that need to be addressed about that is also the French Revolution. I'll probably talk more about it in a second, but because I don't want to make the intro too long. But real quick, I do think that France would probably have, if America didn't exist, France would probably have a system kind of similar to the UK in that they would have probably still have a monarch of some kind, but they just wouldn't have as much power. Like they would have some type of Congress that probably has the main power, and the monarch would be more of like a ceremonial role or a figurehead in a way. At least that's what I believe. But anyway, let's jump into this and see what it has to offer. I will have a link for both Cynical Historian's channel and Atun-Shei's channel. They'll appear in icons over here. If you click on them, it'll take you to their channels. You can watch their content and everything else. I will also have a link for the original video in the description box down below. That way, if you want to watch the video on your own without me talking and pausing, or if you want to react to it yourself, if you happen to be a reactor, or if you want to be, you know, a decent person and watch the original video before you watch the reaction, that is the link that you'll use. Anyway, let's jump into this and see what it has to offer.
Outside the walls of Hotel de Langeac, everything was crazy in 1789. The yells and gunshots of political revolution rang throughout the night. Despite the chaos on the streets, the rooms remained austere, but the flurry of revolution soon came to the hotel. Not as a hail of cannonade, but through a rush of ideas. Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès and Marquis de Lafayette walked into their acquaintance's room. That night they wrote France's founding document, a declaration of sorts. That acquaintance had already written his country's founding declaration, and Thomas Jefferson would consult for the Declaration of the Rights of Man.
Okay.
Hey, Cypher here. Historians often like to talk about how revolutions spread, and there's this general idea of a world revolution, as in how a new power dynamic embodied in an idea can sweep the world, rendering a whole series of revolutions into a singular movement. After all, ideas are inherently transnational. When interpreted this way, we can see that the French Revolution was neither the first nor last of one such world revolution, mainly what's called the bourgeois or Atlantic Revolution. So, who started it? Who's the...
That goes into the thing that I mentioned during the oversimplified French Revolution video, in that had like Karl Marx and them existed at the time, France would have probably fallen into a system of communism after the French Revolution because of the whole bourgeoisie and things like that. It seems like it would have been exactly like all the ingredients necessary to lead to communism.
Called the Bourgeois or Atlantic Revolution. So, who started it? Who's the first mover? Well, that's actually kind of a loaded question. But the first generally recognized event in this Atlantic Revolution was the creation of the United States. And since I've already covered the causes of that revolution, the historiography of it, and how the American Constitution is intellectually dependent on foreign ideology, I think it's time to explore how Americans influenced the French Revolution
that goes for a lot of stuff
followed.
in America.
So this is part of a big collaboration on French history, and a smaller kind of internal one.
That's one of the good things
Atun-Shei
about America.
films. So be sure to check out that playlist if you're not already on it. And anyways, on with the show.
When talking about intellectual history, it's never as easy as saying some idea comes from another place. We all stand on the shoulders of giants. Nothing just gets invented. Instead, we iterate and innovate off of what's come before. That's the nature of creativity. Nothing's new under the sun. The fact is, the American Revolution was just as much influenced by ideology of its time as the French Revolution was indebted to the United States, for they're all rooted in Enlightenment radicalism. As humanism and the secular reaction to the Reformation mixed throughout the 16th century, new philosophies arose. Social contract theory, deism, the scientific method, advanced mathematics, and the heliocentric system all came from this potent mixture. But a stark divide came to define the difference from British philosophers and those of the continent, especially in France. British philosophers like John Locke were less idealistic and more analytical. Their theories had profound consequences, but in a more practical sense, whereas continental philosophers, such as René Descartes, were idealists, questioning the very nature of rationality itself. By the mid-18th century, there were so many of these rationalist intellectuals in France that they got the moniker philosophes. The term can apply to anyone engaging in what's called the Republic of Letters, as in anyone writing these open letters discussing philosophical issues of the day, but we'll get to that later. The term philosophes was primarily referring to Frenchmen. You had folks like Marquis de Condorcet, Denis Diderot, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and most popular of them all, Voltaire. These guys were radicals of their day, speaking openly about challenging the social order and creating a new one. You know, wacky concepts like civil rights, free speech, public education, and tolerance. And most American founding fathers read these folks. Indeed, many were in open contact with them. So this Enlightenment radicalism affected the American Revolution, but they were a nebulous influence at best, save for one philosopher. Montesquieu's anonymous work, The Spirit of the Laws, was the greatest guide to how the American Republic was organized under the Constitution of 1787. The separation of powers through three branches was essentially his idea, and the founders stuck close to his vision. A Frenchman came up with America's governmental structure. But the
France came up with a lot of stuff as far as like America. When you think about like our probably most recognizable symbol, which is the Statue of Liberty, when it comes to us being independent to begin with and their assistance during the Revolutionary War, when it comes to this, America owes a lot to France, a whole lot to France. So it makes me feel even stupider when I think back to the when the War on Terror first broke out and France didn't want to play a part in it. America kind of like start talking shit about them. It makes me feel kind of bad because it's like we owe France a lot.
had an even more direct influence on the American Revolution. The Battle of Saratoga is considered to be the turning point of the American War of Independence, not because of its military significance, but because of its diplomatic implications. Through a stunning victory on the battlefield, incidentally led by Benedict Arnold, King Louis XVI decided to intervene on behalf of the United States. By lending military support, France could defeat Britain and avenge their losses from the 7 Years' War, rebalancing the great powers and scoring another win in their ancient rivalry. And that support helped dearly. Louis sent ground troops under the Marquis de Lafayette, and Rochambeau later, along with a naval fleet which ultimately led to the defeat of Britain in the war. Keep in mind, Lafayette will come up again, because he was a philosophe himself. The war expanded beyond just the American Revolution to an alliance with Spain and the Netherlands against Britain. And it was really a world war, ranging as far and wide as fighting in India, the Caribbean, and even some in Europe, including some fighting in Jersey, which was British territory, and an attempted invasion of Britain, all of which made the war continue into 1783, even though it effectively ended for the US 2 years prior. Still, France gained a lot of new territory as a result, but they incurred a huge debt because of it, and the resulting economic crisis ultimately led to the French Revolution. Parisian riots became more and more common throughout the 1780s. In order to raise taxes, the Estates General assembled, but the inherent inequality of that organization led to a call for a constitutional monarchy, and the inciting incident for armed revolt was the removal of Jacques Necker as finance minister. Financial debt from the American Revolution caused the French Revolution. Before that, the United States sent Ben Franklin to negotiate the terms of this alliance and act as the American minister in France.
Now, people want to talk about Ben Franklin's tendency to skirt chase, but it was the very nature of his skirt chasing that actually helped America get a lot of those diplomatic ties, because he got very close to some key figures' wives and things like that, and they had the ear of the person that he was looking to gain favor with. So the wives put in a good word. That tends to help out. I'm just going to assume that nothing happened between him and those wives. Let's just hope that everything was pure on that end. Well, it doesn't matter what we think. The results are what the results are. It worked out in his favor. So even if something did happen, it doesn't matter. They didn't learn about it. But, I mean, Benjamin Franklin knew... He knew the game.
While serving diplomatic functions, he also instilled some influence that would bring down the very monarchy he worked with. He swaggered about Paris, making a show of American frontiersmanship by wearing furs and acting gruff. Just as they finished the treaties in 1778, Franklin published in French an annotated version of the Pennsylvania Constitution and Poor Richard's Almanac. He altered a great deal to extol the virtues of Republican government, and it instantly became a bestseller in France. It was so popular that when they gave a flagship for John Paul Jones to go raiding with, they named her the Bonhomme Richard, as in Poor Richard, Franklin's pen name. Franklin basically became the nexus of Republican sentiment, and they started using a term called Americanistas. As Condorcet said, Franklin was the only man from America to enjoy a great reputation in Europe. He even very publicly met Voltaire before his death. Franklin's embassy was replaced before the French Revolution, but when it finally came, he died early on, and the French Constituent Assembly declared 3 days of mourning in his honor. He was even later celebrated in the festival of Chateauvieux as a core part of the French Revolution. His ambassadorial replacement, Thomas Jefferson, exerted a direct influence on the French Revolution. He was close friends with Lafayette and secretly encouraged the revolution. Lafayette created the militia that went on to storm the Bastille and inaugurate the revolution. The very symbol of the revolution, the tricolor, was a combination of the militia's colors with the king's color. But Jefferson remained officially aloof to these events, partially because he thought France wasn't ready for liberalism. When it finally came time for Lafayette and Sieyès to write the Declaration of Rights, though, there was one clear person in Paris to proofread it. After all, Jefferson was a Virginian, and their 1776 Declaration of Rights, which was the basis for the French Declaration of the Rights of Man. Jefferson himself penned the Declaration of Independence, which reasserted the then declining notion of natural rights. So of course an argument for those made its way into the Declaration of Rights. It was the culmination of the Radical Enlightenment.
I tried to pause it. I want to read some of the things that this Declaration of Rights of Man says. So Article 1, men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Social distinctions can be found only on common good. The goal of all political association is the conservation of a natural and imprescriptible rights of man. These rights are liberty, property, safety, and resistance against oppression. The principles of any sovereignty resides essentially in the nation. No body or individual can exert. Well, you can skip ahead if you don't want to see me read it. I'm going to read all of it. No individual can exert authority which does not emanate expressly from it. Liberty consists of doing anything which does not harm others. Thus, the exercise of natural rights of each man has only those borders which assume other members of society the enjoyment of these same rights. These borders can be determined only by the law. The law has the right to forbid only actions harmful to society. Anything which is not forbidden by the law cannot be impeded, and no one can be constrained to do what it does not order. The law of the expression of the general will. All the citizens have the right to contributing personally and through their representatives to this formation. It must be the same for all, either that it protests or protects. You know what? I'm gonna go ahead and stop with that one. No one can. Fuck it. I'll read it on my own time. Goddammit. I'm having a hard enough time.
Made its way into the Declaration of Rights. It was the culmination of the radical Enlightenment up to that point. As Condorcet said, humankind had lost its rights. Montesquieu recovered them and gave them back to us, which is actually a Voltaire quote. But it is not enough for these rights to be written in the books of philosophers and in the hearts of virtuous men. Ignorant or weak men must be able to read them in the example of a great people. America has given us this example. Its Declaration of Independence, a simple and sublime exposition of these rights, so sacred and so long forgotten. No nation has known them so well or preserved them with such perfect integrity. Across the channel, another American patriot was making waves. Thomas Payne, author of Common Sense, which basically excited the Continental Congress in 1776 enough to declare independence in the first place, had moved back to London in 1787. In 1791, he wrote a vindication of the rights of man in response to Edmund Burke's...
Didn't something happen to Thomas Payne? I could have sworn... I could be very wrong, but I could have sworn something happened to him, like he was jailed or captured or something like that. I'm going to have to look it up afterwards.
In 1791, he wrote a vindication of the rights of man in response to Edmund Burke's attack on it. But Prime Minister William Pitt thought that was too subversive and had it censured, wanting Payne tried for seditious libel. But Payne arrived in France before that could happen. From France he responded, if to expose the fraud and imposition of monarchy, and even species of hereditary government, to lessen the oppression of taxes, to propose plans for the education of helpless infancy, and the comfortable support of the aged and distressed, to endeavor to conciliate nations to each other, to extirpate the horrid practice of war, to promote universal peace, civilization, and commerce, and to break the chains of political superstition, and raise degraded man to his proper rank. If these things be libelous, let me live the life of a libeler, and let the name of libeler be engraved on my tomb. France gave him a hero's welcome, and along with 17 other foreigners, officially franchised him as a citizen. Payne even served in the Legislative Assembly, but the times were a-changin'. Popular opinion in revolutionary France was turning against the old liberalism of Montesquieu, Franklin, Jefferson, and Payne. Though both Jefferson and Payne were opposed to the US Constitution, they only had small problems with the document, whereas many French writers portrayed it as a betrayal of the revolution. Many called the Federalists adversaries of democratic revolutionary values. France was turning for the worst in 1792. In September, an orgy of violence erupted in Paris, massacring more than 1,000 people. Civil war and insurrection loomed over France, leading to serious counter-revolutionary fervor, all while wars with other European countries began. First, the National Assembly sentenced Louis XVI to the guillotine. But Maximilien Robespierre didn't think that was enough. He created tribunals to weed out and execute traitors to the revolution. Accusations flew, and it was clear France was under a reign of terror. Payne had voted against the execution of King Louis, though he had...
Now, we should probably call McCarthyism Maximilianism or something. It just doesn't roll off the tongue as well. Robespierre probably be the most recognizable name for it, but try turning that into a damn verb to describe fear-mongering.
Under a reign of terror. Payne had voted against the execution of King Louis, though he had voted for the creation of the Republic, so he was one such accusation, landing him in prison. He languished under threat of guillotine for over a year while the terror ran its course. Seeing all this across the Atlantic, the United States took steps to distance herself from France. President George Washington instead ratified the Jay Treaty. It negotiated the British out of America's Northwest Territory and declared U.S. neutrality in the wars over the French Revolution. This was a betrayal of the 1778 alliance with France, though that state had officially ceased to exist in 1792. A few years after that treaty, U.S. neutrality was tested when French officials demanded that American dignitaries...
This was a common practice with negotiations in Europe, but Americans saw it as outdated and tantamount to piracy.
That treaty, U.S. neutrality was tested when French officials demanded that American dignitaries give bribes to enter negotiations in 1797.
I've heard about that.
The XYZ affair, as it's called, spurred on a quasi-war between France and the United States. President Adams even declared Frenchmen enemy aliens through the incredibly contentious Alien and Sedition Acts. It was mostly a bunch of small-scale naval battles and raiding, and the two belligerents came to terms in 1800, officially ending the Franco-American alliance. Obviously, this chain of events had not endeared the French to American liberalism, but they had a new dictator who was more conciliatory. Napoleon gave up his aspirations for a new French colonial empire as Haiti continued to elude his grasp. In fact, during the Quasi-War, Adams had actually sent arms to Haiti to aid in her anti-slavery effort against France. Napoleon's brother was one of the main negotiators at the Convention of 1800 with the Napoleon's...
Go back, hold up. The King of Spain at the time was Napoleon's brother? Well, well, I mean, maybe that's why Napoleon didn't really expand over to Spain, I'm guessing. I could be very wrong about that. I don't know anything about the Napoleon Wars or the Napoleonic Wars. There's an epic history video about that I've been meaning to get on. Matter of fact, there's a commenter that's been commenting like the Spanish War, the Spanish Civil War epic history episode for a long time now. Just know I have seen your comments and I will get to it. It's just I have other stuff on my watch list, but I will get to it very soon. I promise you, very soon. I do hear you.
Brother was one of the main negotiators at the Convention of 1800 with the United States, and he'd eventually control Spain for a few years. But before that, Spain gifted Louisiana Territory back to France in 1800. Napoleon planned to relaunch the French Empire with it, but they failed to conquer Haiti, leaving him as the dejected owner of a useless colony. Meanwhile, in the U.S., a more pro-French politician became president. It was Thomas Jefferson again, and in a show of reconciliation for all this bad blood between the two countries, after they were once so close together, Napoleon sold Louisiana to the U.S. for $15 million, which as the borders became settled, it worked out to be about 3 cents an acre.
After TJ got an astonishingly good deal on Louisiana, Americans from back east started to pour into New Orleans, the territory's only major city. There, Anglo-American culture would eventually merge with the established French, Spanish, and African culture that was already here, but it wasn't a seamless integration. The relationship between the French residents of Louisiana and these American newcomers was a lot like Tuco and Blondie, very much love-hate. Sometimes they would cooperate for mutual benefit, a lot of times they were at each other's throats. In many ways, the relationship between these two peoples was a microcosm of the broader cosmopolitan relationship between their two mother countries at the time. And I get a lot more into that in my addition to Project France, which is up on my channel now. Or, you know, I don't know, it could be. I'm shooting this like 2 weeks into the past, so who's to fucking say? I don't know. Probably it is. Check that out after you finish Cypher's video. Or don't. I'm not the boss of you. Live your own fucking life.
That was Atun-Shei Films, and he's talking about how a microcosm of this dynamic played out in New Orleans. The mixing and clashing of Anglos and Creoles after the purchase showed the strange relationship between France and the US that developed after our revolutions. Though we diverged greatly after the Terror, going so far as to fight a small war, it's hard to deny the tremendous influence Americans had on the French Revolution and vice versa. This doesn't prove one revolution was subordinate to another, or any nonsensical nationalist narrative. Quite the opposite, really. A century before nationalism prevailed, radicals like Ben Franklin and Lafayette inaugurated these revolutions, not as separate occurrences, but in concert with one another. The Atlantic Revolution was tied together by its radicals. Cosmopolitanism drove these events. The idea that the philosophers could have a republic of letters beyond the bounds of typical sovereignty, and that they could speak to each other about these radical ideas regardless of what country they came from, is truly cosmopolitan. Above their allegiances to any particular country, their allegiance was to the Enlightenment. Beginning as a cynical virtue, or as Diogenes said, "I am a citizen of the cosmos." Intellectuals like the Philosophes and the American Founding Fathers took on that cosmopolitanism. For as Thomas Payne said, "Independence is my happiness, and I view things as they are. Without regard to place or person, my country is the world, and my religion is to do good." These intellectuals engaged in ideas that transcended borders. Their citizenship in a republic of letters brought down many real sovereignties to create numerous republics. America might have been the first, but she was just as indebted to France as the French Revolution was to her. A long and windy road left these cosmopolitan ideals behind, burying them in nationalism decades later. But the intellectual history of the Atlantic Revolution did not end in France. Many more came, such as Mexico, the Netherlands, and Gran Colombia. Cosmopolitanism was the real root of the Atlantic Revolution.
Check and see if there was anything else to listen to. Now, first of all, let me go ahead and say that if you enjoy this video, make sure you check out more of Cynical Historian, because he's one of the people that actually let me know just how hard in these streets it is for a historian on YouTube, because a lot of his videos got like demonetized for no reason other than the fact that they cover subjects of history. And a lot of times YouTube doesn't like coverage of history because sometimes history can be kind of dark. Sometimes history can be not so pleasant. But if you're going to censor and cut off people talking about history, then how is that any different than any other type of censorship? Just because it's something you don't like doesn't mean that you don't cover it, or you don't allow other people to cover it. Especially when that person is being honest. So if you want to show them some support, please check out the Patreon. That's the best way you can show him support and continue to allow him to do videos like this. I'm sure Atun-Shei Films has a lot of the exact same issues because he does a lot of coverage of Civil War and World War II Nazi related stuff. And I know for a fact his videos are probably demonetized. So if you want to show them support, check out their Patreons. Yeah, when it comes to enlightenment and things like that, you don't really see that too much anymore. Like back then, all the leaders and even military figures at the time were people that were big into philosophy and talking about like intellectualism and rights of man and this, that, and the other. But nowadays, you don't hear none of that. Like, like, when was the last time you heard a world leader quoting some philosopher or, you know, just something poetic? Like, when was the last time that happened? I have no freaking idea. Like, probably the early 1900s. Like, there's not really anyone that's like a fan of philosophy anymore. Yeah, I'm going to check out more of Cynical Historian's videos as well. He has a lot of videos that I've checked out that I think would be good to do reactions to, like after the fact, because a lot of subjects that he cover are things that I feel like I would have a lot to add on to, and some subjects that are relevant, like today especially, that I think people just need to hear. Now, with that being said, I'm going to give you guys the deuces. I look forward to seeing you guys on a future video. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe, and share. And I will, again, check out their channels. Links will be over here somewhere. And that's pretty much it. So I'm going to give you the deuces, and I am signing out. Deuces.